In southern Peru, at the fortress of Ollantaytambo, 6 enormous andesite blocks sit side by side in a wall roughly 4 meters tall. Each weighs close to 50 tons. They were quarried from a mountainside across the valley, moved across a river and fitted together so precisely that a razor blade will not slide between them. Above this base, the stonework changes smaller blocks, rougher edges, visible gaps. 2 building styles stacked one over the other, as though someone arrived at a foundation already ancient and simply built on top of whatever came before. The hands that shaped those lower stones have been forgotten, but the stones themselves have not. Tonight that quiet contradiction opens into something wider. Across the surface of our world, in places separated by oceans and millennia, similar puzzles appear: walls whose foundations don't match their upper layers, tools found in Earth too old for them, patterns repeated in cultures that had no known contact. None of them prove anything on their own, but together they sketch the faint outline of a possibility we'll follow through this evening. What if an unknown civilization once shaped parts of our world, and was then forgotten, not dramatically, not in a single catastrophe, but slowly the way a name fades from a page left too long in the sun? We won't try to prove or disprove that idea tonight. Instead, we'll move through several quiet layer stones that carry marks older than the cultures credited with the maps that seem to know coastlines, before they were officially charted myths that echo the same event across continents, and traces written not in ink, but in our own DNA. Each layer is partial. Each raises more questions than it settles. And that is exactly the kind of territory where an unhurried evening belongs. If you're settling in somewhere comfortable right now, letting the noise of the day fall behind you, there's no rush here. The questions themselves are worth sitting with. Consider how fragile the record of human existence really is. A wooden structure in a wet climate can dissolve within decades. Cloth and paper burn or rot in centuries. Even stone, given enough weather and enough time, softens back into the earth until it resembles nothing more than a natural ridge. If a civilization built mainly with materials that didn't last or settled along coastlines that now lie 100 meters beneath the ocean, nearly everything they made could be gone. Not hidden deliberately, simply returned to the ground. And yet not everything vanishes at the same rate. Some traces endure where you wouldn't expect them. A spiral carved into rock in ancient Ireland looks almost identical to one etched into a cliff face in the American Southwest, and another found on a Pacific island thousands of kilometers away. A flood story told in Mesopotamia shares its bones with one from southern India from Greece from the Andes. These echoes could be coincidence. Humans facing similar landscapes often arrive at similar symbols. That's a fair reading. But some of the overlaps are strangely precise, not just the broad shape of a story, but specific details within it. Here is one quiet detail worth holding on to. In 2010, researchers confirmed that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions accurately described coastal geography as it appeared more than 7,000 years ago before rising seas reshaped the continent's edges. These weren't vague impressions. They matched modern geological reconstructions of the ancient shoreline with enough precision to surprise the scientists involved. 7,000 years of memory passed from voice to voice, without a single written word to anchor it. If spoken memory can carry that kind of fidelity across such distances of time, then the stories and patterns we find scattered across the world deserve a careful second look. Not because they prove the existence of a forgotten civilization, but because they suggest our past may hold chapters we haven't read yet. Chapters composed in materials that don't survive well by people whose names were never carved into anything that lasted. There's a device pulled from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. A corroded lump of bronze gears no larger than a shoebox. When researchers finally understood what it was, an analog mechanism for predicting eclipses and planetary positions, they realized it was more than 2,000 years old. Nothing of comparable complexity appeared again for over a millennium. When it was first discovered, some assumed it couldn't possibly belong to the ancient world. But it did. It simply arrived earlier than anyone thought such precision was possible. That pattern, something appearing before it, should, according to the timeline we trust, recurs more often than you might expect. Drill holes in ancient granite showing spiral grooves that suggest rotary tools not supposed to exist yet. metallurgy producing steel that resisted corrosion for centuries using techniques modern scientists have only recently managed to replicate. Walls in the Andes and the Mediterranean built with the same polygonal method, enormous irregular blocks fitted without mortar, in regions that according to our records never exchanged a single word. Each of these may have an individual explanation, and many of them probably do. A culture experimenting ahead of its neighbours, an independent invention arrived at twice, a coincidence of geometry and stone. The careful position is always to look for the simplest answer first, and that's a principle worth respecting. But what draws us forward tonight is the cumulative weight of these small puzzles. Not any single one of them, but the way they quietly gather in the foundations beneath temples, in the DNA of populations that were supposed to be isolated, in the distribution of sweet potatoes across the Pacific long before European ships made those crossings, in the faint ghost populations that geneticists can detect in living cells but cannot match to any known people. None of this demands a dramatic conclusion. It asks only for a willingness to sit with the possibility that the story of our past is longer than the version we've been told. That somewhere beneath the civilizations we've named the Sumerians, the Egyptians, the builders of the Indus Valley, there might be another layer. Quieter. Older. Unnamed. Not necessarily grander or more powerful, but present enough to have left fingerprints on the world that came after. This evening we'll follow those fingerprints where they lead, through stone and myth, through ocean floors and star charts, through seeds that travelled farther than they should have and genes that remember journeys no history book recorded. There is no single revelation waiting at the end, only the slow, steady feeling of a picture becoming slightly wider than it was before. So let the room grow still around you, let the day's concerns settle into the background. And we'll begin where most forgotten things begin, not with a grand announcement, but with something small and easy to overlook waiting patiently in the foundation of a wall that someone else built over long ago. What the foundations remember above the city of Cusco. At an altitude where the air thins and the light turns sharp against the Andes, a wall runs along a hillside in 3 enormous zigzag tiers. The stones at its base are not modest. Some weigh over 100 tons, cut into irregular polygonal shapes no two alike, and fitted against one another so tightly that 4 centuries of earthquakes have not shaken them apart. Spanish colonial buildings in the valley below have crumbled and been rebuilt several times. These stones have not moved. The site is called Sacsayhuaman, and it is attributed to the Inca who shaped and maintained it in the centuries before European contact. But there is a quiet disagreement embedded in the structure itself, one that does not announce itself, unless you look carefully at where one style of building ends and another begins. The lowest courses of stone, the largest, the most precisely joined, do not match the style of masonry found in Inca constructions elsewhere. The upper portions are recognizably Inca, carefully shaped, but smaller, more uniform, fitted with visible seams. The base feels like a different sentence spoken by a different voice. That discrepancy is not unique to this hillside. It recurs in places that have no obvious connection to one another, and that is where the quiet problem begins. In Baalbek, in modern-day Lebanon, a Roman temple complex sits atop a platform made of stones so large they dwarf anything the Romans themselves are known to have moved. The 3 largest blocks in the retaining wall, sometimes called the Trelithon, each weigh roughly 800 tons, and a 4th block, still partially attached to its quarry nearly a kilometre away, weighs over 1,000. The Romans built impressive structures across their empire, but nowhere else did they attempt anything on this scale. The platform beneath the temple appears older than the temple itself, and the question of who placed those blocks has never been fully settled. What links Sacsayhuaman and Baalbek is not geography, not culture, not era. It is a pattern. In both places, the most impressive stonework sits at the bottom, the oldest layer, while later builders constructed something lighter and less precise on top. It is the reverse of what a simple model of progress would predict. If knowledge accumulates steadily over time, the newest work should be the most refined. But here the foundation outperforms everything above it, and the hands responsible left no inscription explaining how or why. This pattern appears again at other sites scattered across different continents and different millennia. In parts of Egypt, temple foundations use blocks cut with a precision that the upper walls do not maintain. In certain Aegean structures, the base courses are megalithic, enormous smoothly dressed, while later additions are rougher fieldstone. In each case, the simplest explanation is that the later builders reused what was already there, constructing on top of work they admired but could not replicate. If that is true, it means someone was there first. Someone with the knowledge and organisation to cut, move and fit stones of extraordinary size with extraordinary care. And in most of these locations we do not have a name for who that someone was. It is important to be careful here. Reuse of older materials is common throughout history and does not by itself require an unknown civilization. A culture might dismantle its own earlier work and rebuild over generations. Techniques can be lost within a single society due to political collapse, resource depletion, or simple change in priorities. The Inca themselves went through phases of different construction styles, and what looks like two distinct builders could in theory be one culture at two different stages of its development. But the scale of the difference is what makes some researchers pause. At Sacsayhuaman, the shift between the base and the upper wall is not subtle. It is not the kind of gradual variation you see when a tradition slowly evolves. It looks more like a sharp boundary, one set of hands stopping and another beginning with a gap between them that no one recorded. There is also the question of method. Moving a 100-ton stone block is not simply a matter of assembling more workers. It requires planning, coordination, infrastructure ramps or levers, or counterweights or techniques we may not have identified. When the same kind of massive precise stonework appears in locations separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years, it raises the possibility that the knowledge behind it traveled not necessarily as a blueprint or a written manual, but as a practice carried by people who understood it deeply enough to apply it in very different landscapes. That does not mean those people were a single civilization. They might have been several unrelated groups who independently developed similar skills. Humans are remarkably good at arriving at the same solution from different starting points, and a polygonal wall distributes the force of an earthquake efficiently. Any culture in a seismically active region might eventually discover that given enough time and enough earthquakes. Yet the precision of the fit, the scale of the blocks, and the geographic spread of the style sit together in a way that is difficult to fully resolve. Each example on its own can be explained. Together they form something less like a series of coincidences, and more like the faint edge of a conversation we are only hearing part of. We will not settle that conversation tonight, but we can listen more closely to what the stones themselves seem to say. Not in words, but in the choices made by whoever shaped them. The angle of a cut, the direction of a tool, mark the alignment of a wall to something beyond the horizon. Because stone remembers what voices forget, and in several places around the world, the oldest stones carry marks that do not match any hand. We have yet learned to name marks that suggest the next layer of this story may not be built from stone at all, but from something even older and far more fragile, the memory of where things are. Maps before the map makers. A fragment of gazelle skin, roughly 90 centimetres across, sits in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. It has been there since 1929, when a German theologian noticed it during a survey of the palace library. The skin is a map drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, who noted in its margins that he compiled it from older source charts, some of which he claimed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. The western portion of the map shows the eastern coast of South America in considerable detail, along with the landmass to the south, that some researchers have interpreted as the northern edge of Antarctica rendered, without its ice cover, as if seen in a period when the continent's coastline was exposed. Most mainstream scholars dispute that interpretation, suggesting the southern landmass is simply a distortion of the South American coast, folded to fit the edge of the parchment. That explanation may well be correct. But it does not fully account for the level of coastal detail in other parts of the map, detail that seems difficult to explain solely through the navigational knowledge available in the early 16th century. What makes the Piri Reis map interesting in this context is not the map itself, but what it implies about its sources. If the admiral was telling the truth that he drew from charts far older than his own era, then the question shifts backward in time. Who gathered that geographic knowledge originally, And how did they do it with enough accuracy to be useful centuries later? A map is not a single act of observation. It is the end product of many journeys, each one adding detail, correcting errors, building a picture that no single traveller could assemble alone. To chart a coastline with precision, you need repeated visits, consistent methods of measurement, and a way to record and transmit what you find. That chain of effort is invisible in the finished product. All you see is the result lines on a surface, but behind those lines is a network of knowledge that took generations to build. The detail is small, but it refuses to go away. Someone at some point travelled far enough and carefully enough to produce source material that later map makers found worth preserving for centuries. The Piri Reis fragment is the most famous example, but it is not the only one that raises questions about the age and origin of geographic knowledge. In parts of Europe and the Middle East, stone carvings dating back thousands of years show layouts that appear to represent local landscapes from above rivers, hills, and clusters of settlements drawn from a perspective that would normally require elevation or flight. Without written explanation, certainty is impossible, but the resemblance to aerial views is striking enough that some archaeologists have taken them seriously as early attempts at spatial mapping. These carvings suggest that even without a formal cartographic tradition, people found ways to represent the shape of their world visually, and they did so far earlier than the invention of paper or parchment. Farther east, across the vast Pacific, Polynesian navigators developed a mapping system of their own, one that looked nothing like a European chart but functioned with remarkable effectiveness. Stick charts made from palm ribs and cowrie shells recorded not coastlines, but wave patterns, ocean swells, and the positions of islands relative to currents and prevailing winds. These were not decorative objects. They were working tools refined over centuries, used to cross thousands of kilometres of open ocean with a reliability that European sailors of the same period could not have matched without their instruments. The knowledge to make and read them had to be learned through years of practice and passed from master to apprentice in an unbroken chain. If that chain stretched further back than we currently recognise, it could mean the Pacific was being navigated and mentally mapped long before any written record of such voyages exists. What connects these scattered examples is not a single origin point, but a shared implication. Geographic knowledge may be far older and more widely distributed than the cultures we credit with inventing formal cartography. Maps can be copied, and each copy can be adapted, translated, and modified until the original source is untraceable. A chart drawn on animal skin might survive a few centuries if carefully stored, but the knowledge it contains could travel much further if someone copies it onto new material before the old one decays. Over enough time, a map's lineage becomes invisible. Its details appear to belong to the culture that last redrew it, even if the information was gathered by someone else entirely in a period no one remembers. Some researchers have suggested that certain features on medieval and Renaissance maps, accurate coastlines of regions not yet officially explored islands, positioned where later expeditions confirmed them, could be traces of this kind of inherited knowledge passed from hand to hand across centuries until the original gatherers were forgotten. Of course, there are simpler explanations for many of these features. Sailors talk to one another. Merchants exchange rough sketches of harbours and headlands. Over generations, accumulated coastal lore could produce surprisingly accurate charts, without any need for a lost civilization of master surveyors. That is a reasonable position, and it accounts for much of what we see, but it does not easily explain cases where the accuracy extends to places far beyond known trade routes, or where the geographic detail corresponds to coastlines as they appeared under different sea levels that last existed thousands of years before the map was drawn. Whether those cases are genuine anomalies or simply misreadings of ambiguous evidence remains an open question, and it is a question worth carrying forward as we turn from the memory of places to something even more enduring and even harder to pin down, the memory of events preserved not on skin or stone, but in the structure of stories told so many times that no one remembers who told them first. When stories remember, what records cannot? 7,000 years is a long time to hold a memory. Paper would not last that long. Leather would crumble. Even stone carvings can wear smooth in a fraction of that span. And yet in parts of northern Australia, Aboriginal communities have carried oral accounts of coastal geography. that match the shape of shorelines as they existed more than 7 millennia ago before rising seas, at the end of the last ice age, redrew the continent's edges. When researchers compared these spoken traditions to modern geological reconstructions of the ancient coastline, the correspondence was specific enough to surprise them. The stories did not describe the coast in vague poetic terms. They named bays, headlands, and islands that no longer exist above water, placing them in positions that aligned with what the seabed now confirms. These were not guesses. They were memories carried voice to voice across 300 generations without a single written word to anchor them. That finding changed the way some scholars think about oral tradition. For a long time, myths and spoken histories were treated as unreliable, colourful yes, and sometimes culturally revealing, but too distorted by retelling to contain genuine factual content. The assumption was that without writing information, could not survive more than a few generations before it became unrecognisable. The Australian evidence suggests otherwise. It suggests that under certain conditions, when a community is stable, when the tradition is valued, when the method of transmission is deliberate and disciplined spoken memory, can preserve real information across spans of time that rival or exceed the age of our oldest written records. And if that is possible for coastlines, it may also be possible for events for places, and for the identities of people who lived long before anyone thought to carve their names into anything permanent. Flood myths are among the most widespread narrative patterns in human culture. Nearly every inhabited region of the world has some version of a story in which a great body of water rises and reshapes or destroys the known world. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh describes a flood sent by the gods to cleanse the earth, survived by a single man who builds a vessel and preserves the seeds of life. In Hindu tradition, Manu is warned by a fish to build a boat before the waters come. In Greek mythology, Deucalion and Pyrrha survive a deluge sent by Zeus and repopulate the world by casting stones over their shoulders. Across the Pacific, in Polynesian oral tradition, islands are swallowed by the sea, and new ones rise. In the Andes, the Uru people of Lake Titicaca tell of a time when water covered everything and the survivors took refuge on floating reed islands. The details shift from culture to culture: the cause of the flood, the nature of the warning, the method of survival. But the underlying structure holds remarkably steady, and some researchers argue it means nothing more than the fact that floods happen everywhere and frightened people tell stories about them. That is a fair reading. Flooding is a universal experience. Rivers overflow coastlines, erode storms, drive water inland. Any culture living near water will eventually have a flood to remember, and it would be strange if they did not build stories around it. But what gives some scholars pause is not the existence of flood myths in general. It is the specific convergence of details in myths from regions that had no known contact with one another. When two stories separated by an ocean both describe a prolonged inundation, followed by a period of rebuilding with survivors, guided by a figure who carries knowledge forward into the new world, the overlap begins to feel less like parallel invention and more like parallel memory. The pattern recurs in places it should not, and each recurrence makes the coincidence a little harder to hold comfortably. There is another category of myth that appears across cultures with a similar quiet persistence: the story of the culture bringer. In many traditions around the world, a figure arrives from elsewhere, sometimes from across the sea, sometimes from a distant land, sometimes from a place that no longer exists and teaches the local people something essential. Agriculture, metalwork, navigation, astronomy, the construction of permanent buildings, the measurement of time. The figure is often described in terms that set them apart from the local population, taller, lighter, differently dressed, speaking a language no one recognizes. In some versions, the visitor is treated as a god, in others as a wise stranger. In a few, no physical description is given at all, only the knowledge they brought and the changes that followed. The Viracocha tradition of the Andes, the Quetzalcoatl stories of Mesoamerica, the Oan's account from ancient Sumer, each carries its own texture, its own cultural framing, but the skeleton beneath is strikingly similar. Someone comes from far away, shares what they know, and then disappears. It would be easy to dismiss these as origin myths, stories a culture tells to explain its own beginnings, projecting the source of knowledge outward rather than claiming it as homegrown. That interpretation is reasonable and may account for many of them. But when the same narrative pattern appears in societies separated by thousands of kilometers and thousands of years with no documented pathway of cultural exchange between them, it invites a second look. Not a conclusion, a look. The possibility, however faint, that these stories preserve the distant memory of real encounters with real people whose knowledge was genuinely unfamiliar. People who came, taught, and moved on, leaving behind not monuments, but methods, not inscriptions, but influence. The difficulty with myths is that they are layered. Each generation of retelling adds something: a dramatic flourish, a moral lesson, a local reference that makes the story feel closer to home. Over centuries, the original event can be buried so deeply under these additions that separating fact from embellishment becomes almost impossible. A real leader becomes a god. A skilled navigator becomes someone who could command the wind. A settlement destroyed by a tsunami becomes a city swallowed whole by divine punishment. The transformation is gradual, and in most cases irreversible. But occasionally, beneath all the layers, a practical detail survives: a description of a technique, a reference to a specific star, a geographic feature that can still be identified. And that detail sits in the story like a fossil in sediment unchanged, while everything around it shifted. These are the fragments that some researchers spend entire careers trying to extract, comparing myth against myth, culture against culture, looking for the thread that does not belong to any single storyteller, but seems to run beneath all of them, connecting voices that never heard each other speak. Whether that thread leads back to a forgotten civilization, or simply to the shared instincts of human memory, is something the stories alone cannot tell us, but the stones as it happens may have something to add, because in certain places the myths and the masonry point in the same direction. The marks that do not match. In the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, in a room that most visitors pass through without stopping, there is a collection of stone vessels carved from some of the hardest materials available in the ancient world: granite, basalt, diorite, schist. Some are no larger than a teacup, others are wide enough to hold several litres. What makes them remarkable is not their size but their finish. The interiors are hollowed out with a symmetry so consistent that when measured with modern instruments, the walls vary by less than a fraction of a millimetre in thickness. The curves are smooth, and even the rims perfectly circular. The base is flat to a degree that would challenge a modern machinist working with powered tools. These vessels are dated to the earliest dynasties of Egypt, some possibly to the pre-dynastic period, a time when the only tools available according to the accepted record were made of copper and stone. Copper is softer than granite. Stone can shape stone, but not with this precision, not at this scale, not with this consistency across hundreds of surviving examples. The vessels are not secret. They have been catalogued, measured and discussed in academic literature for decades, but they remain for the most part unexplained in terms of method. Experimental archaeologists have tried to reproduce them using the tools known to have been available in that period, and the results fall short. The reproductions are rougher, less symmetrical, and show tool marks that do not match what appears on the originals. This does not mean the ancient Egyptians could not have made them. It means we have not yet figured out how they did it with the tools we believe they had. And that small gap between what the objects show and what the known toolkit can produce is the kind of detail that sits quietly in the record, easy to overlook but difficult to dismiss once you have seen it. Similar gaps appear in other places and other periods. At Pumapunku, a site near Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, blocks of andesite and red sandstone have been cut with flat surfaces, sharp interior angles, and precisely drilled holes that repeat at uniform intervals. Some of the cuts are so clean and geometrically exact that they resemble the output of machine tooling rather than hand carving. The site is attributed to the Tiwanaku civilization, which flourished roughly between 500 and 1000 CE, but some of the stonework at Pumapunku has features that are difficult to reconcile with the tools and techniques associated with that culture. The 8-shaped blocks, for instance, interlock in a modular fashion, like oversized puzzle pieces designed for assembly, and possibly disassembly, a concept that feels more like engineered prefabrication than traditional monumental construction. And yet no written record from the Tiwanaku explains how these blocks were made or what system of measurement guided their proportions. The question is not whether ancient people were capable of impressive work; they clearly were, and the tendency to underestimate their ingenuity is itself a kind of bias worth correcting. The question is narrower than that. It is about specific marks on specific stones that do not correspond to any known process from the period in which they were supposedly made. In parts of the Serapeum at Saqqara, enormous granite boxes, each weighing roughly 70 tons, sit inside underground chambers carved from limestone. The interior surfaces of these boxes are polished to a flatness measurable in thousandths of an inch, and the corners meet at angles so precise that modern optical instruments are required to detect deviation. These are not decorative flourishes. They are feats of engineering that demand either tools we have not found or methods we have not imagined, and the absence of either in the archaeological record is itself a piece of evidence, not proof of anything, but a space in the story where something is clearly missing. Some researchers argue that the missing piece is simply our understanding. Ancient craftspeople may have developed techniques that were highly effective, but did not require the kind of hard metal tools we associate with precision work. Abrasive powders, patient grinding wooden jigs, and guides copper tubes fed with quartz sand. All of these have been proposed and some have been partially demonstrated in experiments. These explanations deserve serious consideration, and in many cases they may be correct. But even their proponents acknowledge that replicating the finest ancient work using only these methods remains extremely difficult, and in some cases has not been fully achieved. The gap narrows with each experiment, but it is not closed, and for some objects it remains stubbornly wide. Some researchers argue it means nothing more than insufficient experimental effort. Others suspect it points to a chapter of technical history that has not yet been written. What makes the tool mark question relevant to the broader mystery is its geographic breadth. Precision stonework with unexplained characteristics does not appear in only one culture or one continent. It appears in Egypt, in South America, in parts of the Mediterranean, and in isolated examples across Asia and the Pacific. The styles differ, the materials differ, the scales differ, but the underlying puzzle is the same. Surfaces too flat curves, too even holes, too uniform for the tools we think were available. Each instance might be an independent achievement, a local breakthrough that was later lost. That is entirely possible, and in some cases it is probably the correct explanation. But the recurrence of the pattern across such distances and such different cultural contexts raises a quieter possibility that the knowledge behind these techniques was not invented separately each time, but transmitted from a source old enough and widespread enough to have touched many places before fading from the record entirely. We cannot follow tool marks across oceans the way we might follow a trade route or a genetic marker. They do not move on their own, but they point to capabilities that in some cases seem to have arrived fully formed and then slowly diminished a trajectory that does not fit the standard model of gradual technological progress, but fits quite comfortably with the idea of inherited knowledge whose source has been forgotten. And if that source once existed, it may have left traces not only in stone, but in something even more intimate and far more durable, the biological record written inside the cells of the people who came after them. Ghost populations and the memory in our cells. In 2010, a small fragment of bone, the tip of a pinky finger, no larger than a coin, was recovered from Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. It was not an impressive find by archaeological standards. There were no inscriptions, no tools beside it, no burial goods to suggest the status of the person it belonged to. But when geneticists extracted and sequenced the DNA from that fragment, they found something that did not match any known human lineage. It was not Homo sapiens, it was not Neanderthal, it was something else, a distinct branch of the human family tree that had never been identified through fossils, never been described in any anatomy textbook, never been suspected from the physical record at all. An entire population of ancient humans revealed not by bones or buildings, but by the molecular code inside a chip of finger no one would have looked at twice. The Denisovans, as they came to be called, are now known to have interbred with modern human populations, and traces of their DNA persist today in people across Southeast Asia, Melanesia, and parts of Australia, sometimes comprising as much as 5% of an individual's genome. A people who left behind almost nothing physical are still present, not in stone or metal, but in the living cells of their descendants. That discovery changed the way many researchers think about what it means to leave a trace. We are accustomed to measuring a civilization's presence by the things it built: walls, roads, monuments, written records. But genetics offers a different kind of archive, one that does not depend on construction materials or preservation conditions. It travels inside people, replicating itself with every generation, carrying forward information about encounters that happened tens of thousands of years ago. And unlike a stone wall or a clay tablet, it cannot be destroyed by weather, buried by sand, or dissolved by rising seas. It can only be diluted slowly over millennia until the signal becomes faint, but even a faint signal with the right tools can still be read. The implication is unsettling in the gentlest possible way. If an entire branch of humanity can exist for hundreds of thousands of years and leave behind only a finger bone and a few teeth, then the absence of physical evidence for a population does not mean that population never existed. It means only that we have not found the right place to look, or that the evidence was written in a language we are only now learning to read. Modern genetic research has revealed several so-called ghost populations groups whose existence is inferred entirely from DNA found in living people, or ancient remains with no corresponding archaeological record. In West Africa, for instance, statistical analysis of modern genomes has identified genetic contributions from an archaic population that has never been matched to any known fossil. In South Asia, similar studies have detected ancient admixture events involving groups that do not appear in the physical record of the subcontinent. These are not small marginal signals. They represent significant contributions to the gene pools of large modern populations, meaning the ghost groups were not isolated individuals, but communities substantial enough and persistent enough to leave a measurable imprint on the genetic landscape of entire regions. And yet of their culture, their language, their tools, their stories, nothing survives except the code they passed into the bloodstreams of others. This has particular relevance when we consider the possibility of an unknown civilization that influenced the cultures we already recognize. If such a group existed and travelled widely, trading, teaching, intermarrying with local populations across distant regions, their genetic signature might be precisely the kind of signal that modern tools can detect. It would not look like a single dramatic admixture event, but more like a subtle, widespread thread appearing in populations that were not supposed to have had contact with the same outside source. Some researchers have noted unexpected genetic similarities between populations separated by vast distances, markers that do not align neatly with known migration routes or established models of human dispersal. In most cases, these anomalies have conventional explanations: ancient land bridges, coastal migrations, or simply the limits of current modelling. But in a few instances, the genetic data suggests contact between groups at times and in places where no known mechanism of exchange has been identified. These are not conclusions. They are open questions, gaps in the narrative where something happened that we have not yet accounted for. There is also the question of what traits such contact might have left behind. Genetic exchange does not just leave neutral markers. It can carry functional adaptations, resistance to certain diseases, tolerance for particular diets, physiological adjustments to altitude or climate. When a population acquires such an adaptation rapidly, it often means they received it through interbreeding with a group that had already developed it over many generations. If a forgotten civilization had spent centuries adapting to specific environments, coastal living, high-altitude agriculture, long-distance seafaring, and then mixed with other populations, some of those adaptations could persist in modern people long after every other trace of the original group has vanished. We might be carrying their biological legacy in ways we attribute to our own evolutionary history, unaware that the advantage was borrowed rather than built from scratch. The humbling truth about genetics is that it reveals how little of the human story is captured by the records we traditionally rely on. Writing is only a few thousand years old, and monumental architecture goes back perhaps 12,000 years at most. But the genetic record stretches across hundreds of thousands of years, encoding encounters, migrations and mixtures that no one documented and no one remembered. Every living person carries within them a history far older and far more complex than any archive made of paper or stone. And somewhere in that history woven into the helical threads of our DNA, there may be the signature of people who shaped the world in ways we are only beginning to suspect, people whose influence travelled not through monuments or manuscripts, but through the most intimate channel of all the simple act of having children who survived. If such signatures exist, they would not tell us what those people built or what they believed. But they would tell us something equally important, that they were real, that they were here, and that they moved through the world widely enough to touch the ancestry of people living today. The question of what they knew and how they shared it requires a different kind of evidence, the kind that is not hidden inside cells, but written across the surface of the earth, in the shapes of buildings that should not exist where they do. The weight of coincidence. It would be dishonest to move forward without pausing here. Everything we have touched so far, the mismatched foundations, the maps that seem to know too much, the myths that echo across oceans, the tool marks that resist easy explanation, the ghost populations hiding in our DNA, all of it is suggestive. None of it is proof. And the distance between suggestion and proof is not a small gap that a few more discoveries might close. It is a fundamental difference in kind, the difference between noticing a pattern and understanding what caused it. Patterns are seductive. The human mind is built to find them, to connect scattered points into coherent shapes, to see faces in clouds and intention in randomness. That instinct has served us well. It is part of what makes us curious, creative, and capable of science. But it is also the source of our most persistent errors, because the mind that finds real patterns is the same mind that invents false ones, and it cannot always tell the difference from the inside. The most common objection to the idea of an unknown civilization is also the simplest convergent development. Human beings, regardless of where or when they live, face many of the same problems. They need shelter, food, water, warmth, and ways to organize groups larger than a single family. When similar problems are met with similar resources, stone, wood, clay, fiber, similar solutions often follow. A polygonal wall resists earthquakes not because its builders learned the technique from a mysterious outside source, but because irregular interlocking shapes distribute force more effectively than uniform rows, and any culture in a seismically active region might discover that principle through trial and error over enough generations. A spiral appears in the art of cultures separated by oceans not because someone carried the symbol from one to the other, but because spirals are among the most natural shapes the human hand can draw, and the human eye can find in shells in water, in the growth patterns of plants, in the apparent motion of stars around the pole. The flood myth appears everywhere, not because every culture remembers the same ancient flood, but because floods happen everywhere, and the experience of losing everything to rising water is universal enough to generate strikingly similar stories without any shared origin. These explanations are not dismissals. They are serious, well-supported interpretations of the evidence, and in many individual cases they are almost certainly correct. The spiral carved into a stone in Ireland and the spiral pecked into a cliff in Arizona do not need a common ancestor. The precision of certain Egyptian stone vessels may eventually be explained by experimental archaeology as techniques improve and our understanding of ancient craftsmanship deepens. The genetic signals that look anomalous today may resolve into conventional migration patterns as more data becomes available and models grow more sophisticated. Each piece of evidence that seems to point towards something unknown also has at least one explanation that does not require anything beyond the known capabilities of the cultures involved. That is not a weakness in the skeptical position, it is its strength. Science advances by preferring the explanation that requires the fewest new assumptions, and the idea of a forgotten civilization is by any measure a very large assumption. There is also the problem of selection bias. When you're looking for a pattern, you tend to notice the things that fit and overlook the things that do not. For every stone wall whose lower courses seem more advanced than its upper ones, there are hundreds of walls where the construction is consistent from bottom to top. For every myth that echoes across continents, there are thousands of stories that are entirely local, with no parallel anywhere else. For every artifact that seems out of place, there are millions that sit comfortably in the timeline exactly where they belong. The anomalies are real, but they are anomalies precisely because they are rare. And building a theory on rare exceptions while ignoring the vast body of evidence that fits the conventional picture is a methodological risk that responsible researchers take seriously. It is not enough to show that something is unexplained. You have to show that the existing explanations are inadequate, and that a new explanation, even one as dramatic as a lost civilization, does a better job of accounting for the full range of evidence, not just the unusual pieces. And yet, the skeptical position, strong as it is, does not entirely close the door. It explains the individual cases well, but it is less comfortable with the accumulation. When the same kind of anomaly, precision beyond expected capability knowledge appearing before its supposed origin, structural similarities across unconnected regions recurs in enough different contexts, the coincidence itself becomes something that needs explaining, not because any single instance is inexplicable, but because the frequency and distribution of these instances begin to form a pattern of their own, a pattern that convergent development alone does not fully predict. A skeptic might say that this is simply what happens when you look at a large enough dataset. You will always find clusters of outliers that appear meaningful, but are statistically inevitable. That may be true, but it is also true that some clusters of outliers have turned out to be the first signs of something genuinely new, something the existing framework had not accounted for. The history of science is full of moments where the anomalies that were set aside for decades eventually became the foundation of a revised understanding. So the honest position is not certainty in either direction. It is discomfort, the productive kind, the kind that keeps questions open rather than closing them prematurely. It may be that every trace we have examined tonight has an ordinary explanation, and that the pattern we sense is an artifact of our own pattern-seeking minds. It may also be that the pattern is pointing towards something real, something the evidence has not yet been sufficient to confirm or deny. The discomfort is that we cannot be sure, and the only responsible thing to do with that discomfort is to carry it forward rather than resolve it artificially, because beyond the skeptic's caution and the theorist's imagination, there is a body of evidence that does not depend on interpretation alone. Evidence built into the orientation of walls, the angles of corridors, and the positions of stones relative to the sky, where the question is not what we believe, but what we can measure. The sky as a clock that never stopped. On the morning of the winter solstice, if you stand inside the passage tomb at Newgrange in Ireland's Boyne Valley, you will see something that was designed to happen more than 5,000 years ago. A narrow beam of sunlight enters through a small opening above the main doorway, a roof box deliberately constructed and angled with care, and travels 17 metres down a stone-lined corridor until it reaches the central chamber, where it illuminates the floor and the carved back wall for approximately 17 minutes before withdrawing. The alignment is not approximate. It is precise to within a single degree of arc, calibrated to the exact point on the horizon, where the sun rises at its lowest annual position. The structure predates the Egyptian pyramids by roughly 5 centuries and Stonehenge by nearly 1,000 years. Its builders left no written record of how they calculated the alignment or why they considered it worth embedding in 63 metres of stone and earth. But the light still arrives on schedule every December, indifferent to the fact that the people who arranged it have been gone for 50 centuries. Newgrange is one of the most carefully studied examples of astronomical alignment in ancient architecture, but it is far from the only one. Across the world, structures of vastly different ages and cultural origins share a common feature. They are oriented not randomly, not according to the shape of the local terrain, but in deliberate reference to the movements of celestial bodies. The temples of Angkor Wat align to the spring equinox sunrise. The Great Pyramid of Giza is oriented to true north, with an accuracy of 3/60ths of a degree. At Chichen Itza, the descending shadow of a feathered serpent appears on the staircase of El Castillo only during the equinoxes, the product of an architectural geometry that required both astronomical knowledge and the engineering skill to translate it into stone. Each of these examples belongs to a known civilization with a documented interest in the sky. But the consistency of the practice, the impulse to anchor heavy permanent structures to the movements of light, is itself a kind of pattern, one that appears so early and so widely that it raises a question not about any single culture, but about the depth of the tradition itself. Tracking the sun's position at the solstice is in principle not difficult. It requires patience, a clear horizon, and a way to mark positions over consecutive years. Any attentive observer could manage it within a generation. But some ancient alignments go further than the solstice. They reference the positions of specific stars and that introduces a complication that most casual observers would never notice. The Earth's axis wobbles slowly over a cycle of approximately 26,000 years, a phenomenon called precession, and as it does, the positions of the stars shift gradually against the horizon. A structure aligned to a particular star today would point to a slightly different position a few centuries from now, and a very different one several thousand years later. When an ancient building aligns to a star as it appeared not at the time the building is believed to have been constructed, but at an earlier date it suggests one of two things. Either the building is older than we think, or its builders had access to astronomical knowledge, accumulated over a much longer period than their own civilization's known history. Some researchers argue this is evidence that points back beyond the cultures we have named, and while that remains contested, the precision of certain alignments is difficult to attribute to guesswork or accident. There is a subtler dimension to this as well. Astronomy is not just about observing, it is about recording, calculating, and predicting. To build a structure aligned to a future solstice sunrise or a past stellar position, you need more than sharp eyes. You need a system for translating observation into measurement and measurement into construction. You need geometry, or at least a working equivalent. You need a way to communicate precise spatial information to the people, cutting and placing the stones. And you need continuity, a tradition of sky watching sustained over enough generations that the slow drift of precession becomes visible and can be accounted for. That kind of continuity implies institutional memory, a method of education, and a reason to consider the sky important enough to build your most permanent structures around it. When we find that commitment in cultures we know well, the Maya, the Egyptians, the builders of Angkor, we attribute it to their documented interest in astronomy and religion. But when we find it in structures that predate those cultures, or in places where no known astronomical tradition has been recorded, the attribution becomes less certain, and the question of origin returns. The sky itself has not changed in any way that would make ancient observations invalid. The stars are for practical purposes the same stars that shone over whoever first thought to track them. Precession shifts their positions slowly, but it does so in a cycle that is mathematically predictable, which means that if we know when a structure was built, we can calculate what the sky looked like at that time, and check whether the alignment holds. In some cases, it does confirming the conventional dating. In others, the best astronomical fit corresponds to a date significantly earlier than the accepted construction period, and those cases tend to generate quiet but persistent debate. They do not overturn the established timeline on their own, but they add to the accumulating weight of instances where the knowledge embedded in a structure seems older than the structure itself, as though the builders were working from a template they inherited, rather than one they devised. And if that template was passed down from a source we have not identified, it may have travelled the same routes as another kind of inheritance, not celestial knowledge carved into walls, but practical knowledge carried in the holds of ships and the hands of traders moving along pathways that conventional history says should not have existed yet. Roots that should not exist. How does a bead made from lapis lazuli, a stone found naturally only in the mountains of northeastern Afghanistan, end up in a burial site on the banks of the Nile more than 5,000 years ago? The distance between the 2 points is roughly 4,000 kilometers, crossing deserts, mountain ranges, and the territories of multiple cultures that may or may not have been in regular contact with one another. The bead itself is small, it fits between 2 fingers, but the journey it represents is enormous, implying not a single act of transport but a chain of exchanges, each link involving people who knew where the material came from, what it was worth, and who might want it next. One bead is a curiosity, but lapis lazuli appears consistently in early Egyptian contexts in quantities that suggest not occasional lucky finds, but a sustained reliable supply stretching back to the earliest phases of the civilization. Someone maintained that chain for centuries, and the organizational effort required to do so across such distances through such varied terrain is not trivial. It implies networks, and networks imply knowledge of geography negotiation with intermediaries, and a shared understanding of value that crossed cultural and linguistic boundaries long before any of it was written down. The lapis lazuli trade is well documented and does not by itself require the existence of an unknown civilization. It fits within the known frameworks of early Bronze Age exchange. but it serves as a useful illustration of how far materials could travel in the ancient world and how much infrastructure, social, logistical, geographical that movement required. When we encounter similar distributions of materials in periods or places where no such infrastructure has been identified, the implications become harder to manage. Obsidian from Anatolia has been found at sites across the eastern Mediterranean, dating to periods when long-distance maritime trade was not believed to have been established. Certain types of jade appear in contexts separated by thousands of kilometres with no known intermediate sources, and in a few cases materials show up on the wrong side of an ocean, entirely raising questions that conventional trade models struggle to answer, without invoking contact that the accepted timeline does not yet support. Each of these findings taken alone can be explained. Materials can be passed hand to hand through many intermediaries over generations, accumulating distance without any single carrier travelling the full route. But when the same pattern of unexpected distribution appears across different materials, different periods and different regions, it begins to suggest that ancient networks of exchange may have been wider, older, and more organised than our current maps of early trade acknowledge. One case that continues to generate discussion is the presence of nicotine and cocaine residues found in Egyptian mummies during studies conducted in the early 1990s. Both substances are derived from plants native to the Americas, tobacco and coca, and their presence in remains dated to well before any known transoceanic contact posed an obvious problem. The findings were controversial from the moment they were published, and critics raised legitimate concerns about contamination methodology and the possibility that the plants had Old World relatives that have since gone extinct. Those objections have not been fully resolved, and the studies remain disputed. But the detail persists in the literature like a stone in a shoe, not quite comfortable enough to ignore, not quite solid enough to build on. If the residues are genuine and uncontaminated, they imply a connection between the ancient Mediterranean and the Americas that predates every known voyage by thousands of years, and that is a possibility most historians are understandably reluctant to accept without stronger evidence. Less dramatic, but perhaps more telling, are the cases where it is not a single exotic material that appears out of place but an entire technique. Metallurgical methods for producing arsenical bronze, an alloy that predates tin bronze in many regions, appear in widely separated parts of the world during roughly similar periods, using processes that share specific characteristics not easily explained by independent invention alone. The same is true for certain styles of textile production, where weaving patterns of considerable complexity show up in cultures that had no documented contact with one another, using methods so similar that textile specialists have noted the parallels with a mixture of fascination and caution. Techniques unlike materials do not travel passively. A lapis lazuli bead can be passed from hand to hand without anyone along the chain understanding how it was made. But a smelting process or a weaving method requires direct transmission. Someone who knows how to do it must teach someone who does not, and that teaching requires proximity time and a shared interest in the outcome. When the same technique appears in two places with no known link, it implies either that both populations independently solve the same technical problem in the same specific way, or that the knowledge travelled between them through a channel we have not yet identified. There is also the question of timing. In several cases, a sophisticated technique appears in the archaeological record of a region without clear local antecedents, no simpler version, no experimental phase, no gradual development from cruder methods. It arrives, as it were, fully formed, as though the people using it learned it from somewhere else, rather than developing it on their own. This is not always mysterious. A neighbouring culture with a longer history of the technique might have shared it through ordinary contact. But when the nearest known source of the technique is separated by an ocean or a millennium, the explanation becomes less straightforward, and the gap in the record starts to resemble not an absence of evidence, but evidence of an absence, a missing link in a chain that clearly existed because the endpoints are there even if the middle is not. Trade routes do not fossilise. Unlike buildings or tools, a path leaves no permanent mark unless it is paved or walled, and most ancient routes were neither. They were simply the paths people walked, sailed, or paddled often enough to wear faint traces into the landscape, traces that a few decades of disuse could erase entirely. What survives is not the route itself, but the cargo, A bead here, a shard there, a chemical residue in a clay vessel, a technique embedded in a tradition. These remnants are scattered across museums and storage rooms around the world, often catalogued under the cultures that last used them, rather than the ones that first sent them on their way. Reassembling the original network from such fragments is like reconstructing a river from the sediment it deposited in a dozen separate deltas, possible in principle, painstaking in practice, and always incomplete. But the sediment is real, and it had to come from somewhere. And in some cases, that somewhere may lie in a direction no one has thought to look. Not along a known coastline or across a familiar desert, but in the deep past of a people whose roots were so old that even the memory of them has been washed away, leaving only the cargo behind and perhaps the seeds they carried with them to places where those seeds had never grown before. Seeds that crossed the water before the ships. We know. The sweet potato is not a seafaring plant. It does not float well, does not survive prolonged immersion in salt water, and does not distribute itself across oceans by clinging to driftwood or riding in the guts of migratory birds. It is a root crop fragile when uprooted, dependent on human hands for propagation beyond its native range. Its origin is South America, the coastal lowlands of Peru and Ecuador, where it was cultivated for thousands of years before European ships arrived. And yet, when the first European explorers reached Polynesia, they found the sweet potato already there, growing in garden plots scattered across islands, separated from South America by more than 8,000 kilometers of open Pacific. The plant had a local name Kumara in many Polynesian languages, and it was deeply embedded in agricultural traditions that showed no sign of recent introduction. Radiocarbon dating of sweet potato remains recovered from archaeological sites in the Cook Islands, has placed its arrival in Polynesia as early as 1000 CE, roughly 5 centuries before any European vessel crossed the Pacific. Something carried it across that ocean, and that something was almost certainly human. The sweet potato is the most widely discussed example of a plant that appears where it should not, given the conventional understanding of who was travelling where and when. But it is not the only one. The bottle gourd, one of the earliest domesticated plants in the Americas, has been found in archaeological contexts in Asia and Africa at dates that precede any known transoceanic contact by thousands of years. Genetic analysis of bottle gourd specimens suggests that the American varieties are more closely related to African ones than to any wild population that might have served as an independent source of domestication, implying that the plant or its seeds crossed the Atlantic at some point in a deep prehistory. The most conservative explanation is that gourds floated across on ocean currents, arriving viable on distant shores by chance. That is possible for a plant whose hard shell offers some protection against salt water, but it does not explain how the gourd then entered cultivation in its new home, a process that requires human recognition of the plant's usefulness, deliberate planting, and sustained attention over multiple growing seasons. The seed may have arrived by accident. Its integration into agriculture almost certainly did not. Cotton presents another quiet puzzle. There are 2 primary species of domesticated cotton, one native to the Old World and one to the New, and the New World species turns out to be a hybrid, carrying genetic material from both an American wild cotton and an Old World variety. The hybridization event that produced it is ancient, predating human agriculture entirely by some estimates, which means it may have occurred through natural dispersal rather than deliberate human transport. But the fact that the resulting hybrid was then independently domesticated in the Americas, producing fibers remarkably similar in quality and used to those cultivated on the other side of the ocean, has prompted some researchers to wonder whether the story is quite as simple as 2 separate traditions developing in parallel. The genetic evidence does not require human intervention in the hybridization itself, but it does raise the question of whether knowledge of cotton cultivation, the techniques of spinning, weaving, processing, might have travelled between hemispheres at some early stage, carried by people who understood what the plant could do and showed others how to use it. That question remains open, and the genetic data alone cannot close it. But it adds one more thread to a pattern that keeps appearing wherever botanists look closely at the distribution of ancient crops. Plants are not glamorous evidence. They do not glitter like gold or tower like stone monuments. A seed is small, perishable, and easy to overlook in an excavation focused on pottery or architecture. But seeds carry information that stones do not. A plant's DNA records its evolutionary history with a precision that no carved symbol can match. And when that history includes a sudden geographic jump, a variety appearing thousands of kilometers from its nearest relative with no intermediate populations to mark the path, it tells us that something moved it. And that something had to cross the distance in a way that kept the seed viable on arrival. For most of human history, that means a person carried it knowingly or not in a pouch or a bundle, or the hold of a vessel across water or land that the accepted narrative says they should not have been able to cross at that time. The detail is small, but it refuses to go away, because every attempt to explain these distributions without invoking early long-distance human contact requires a chain of improbable natural accidents, each one plausible on its own but increasingly difficult to sustain when they must be repeated for multiple species across multiple oceans. There is also the matter of agricultural knowledge itself. A seed that arrives in new soil is useless without someone who knows how to grow it, when to plant, how deep, how much water, what kind of soil, when to harvest. Some crops require processing before they are even edible. Cassava, for instance, must be carefully prepared to remove toxic compounds, a process that involves specific steps unlikely to be discovered by accident. When a processed crop appears in a region far from its origin, it implies not just the transport of the plant, but the transmission of the knowledge required to use it safely. That knowledge is cultural, not biological. It does not travel in the seed's DNA. It travels in human memory passed from one person to another through demonstration and instruction, and its presence in a distant land is evidence of contact far more intimate than a gourd washing up on a beach. If a forgotten civilization moved across the world's oceans, teaching as they went, the most durable evidence of their passage might not be a ruin or an inscription, but a garden rows of plants growing in soil where they did not originate, tended by people who learned the method from someone whose name was lost before the first harvest was complete. And those gardens, in turn, would have changed everything about the communities that kept them, not just what they ate, but how they organized their labor, how they measured their seasons, and how they understood the shape of the world beyond their own horizon, a shape that someone at some point had mapped well enough to find these shores and carry something worth planting. Civilizations that arrived. Already. Knowing. How does a society go from scattered villages of hunter-gatherers to building a monumental stone complex with carved pillars, animal reliefs and precisely arranged enclosures without any apparent intermediate phase? That is the question that Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey has posed since serious excavation began in the mid-1990s. The site dates to approximately 9,500 BCE, making it roughly 11,500 years old, older than pottery in the region, older than agriculture as we currently define it, older than any known permanent settlement of comparable complexity. The carved T-shaped pillars, some standing over 5 meters tall and weighing up to 10 tons, are decorated with detailed reliefs of animals, foxes, cranes, scorpions, wild boar rendered with a confidence that suggests practiced skill rather than first experiments. There is no village underneath it. There is no simpler version of it nearby that shows how the idea developed. It appears in the archaeological record as though someone already knew what they were doing and came to this hilltop to do it. And then, after roughly 2,000 years of use, the entire site was deliberately buried, filled in with rubble and earth by the people who had used it as if they wanted it preserved, but hidden sealed away from whatever came next. Göbekli Tepe is not the only site that presents this pattern of sudden sophistication. In Mesopotamia, the earliest cities of Sumer, Urartu, Urartu emerge in the archaeological record, with systems of irrigation, administrative tools, and monumental architecture that seem remarkably well developed for their supposed starting point. The transition from small agricultural settlements to complex urban centres happens with a speed that has puzzled historians for decades. Writing itself appears not as a gradual evolution from simple marks to complex script, but as a system already capable of recording transactions, inventories, and eventually narratives within a few centuries of its first known appearance. The conventional explanation is that we are simply missing the developmental phases, that the experimental versions existed, but were made from materials that did not survive, or that they took place in regions we have not yet excavated. That is plausible, and it may prove correct as more sites are uncovered. But the gap remains, and each time a new discovery pushes the timeline of complexity further back. Without revealing the expected precursors, the gap widens rather than narrows. In Egypt, a similar puzzle appears at the very beginning of the Old Kingdom. The Step Pyramid at Saqqara, attributed to the architect Imhotep around 2670 BCE, is traditionally described as the first monumental stone building in history, and yet it is not crude. It is not the tentative first effort you might expect from a civilization experimenting with a new material. The precision of its internal chambers, the sophistication of its subterranean galleries, and the quality of the limestone casing all suggest a level of mastery that does not emerge from nothing. Within a few generations, Egyptian builders were constructing the Great Pyramid at Giza, a structure whose base is level to within 2 centimeters across 13 acres, whose sides are aligned to true north, with an error smaller than the width of a human hand. The learning curve implied by moving from the Step Pyramid to the Great Pyramid in roughly a century is steep enough that some researchers have questioned whether the starting point of that curve is really where we think it is, or whether it began much earlier in a tradition we have not yet traced to its source. The pattern recurs in the Americas. At Corral, on the coast of Peru, a complex of pyramids, plazas, and sunken amphitheatres dates to roughly 2600 BCE, making it contemporary with the early Egyptian pyramids, and far older than any other known urban centre in the Western Hemisphere. Carroll shows no evidence of warfare, no weapons, no fortifications, no depictions of conflict. But it does show evidence of organised labour, long-distance trade in goods, like spondylus shells, and a level of architectural planning that suggests centralised coordination. Like Göbekli Tepe, like early Sumer, like Old Kingdom Egypt, it seems to arrive with its capabilities already in place, as though the knowledge behind it had been developing somewhere else for some time before it crystallised in this particular location. That impression of knowledge arriving rather than being born locally is not proof of external influence. It is an observation about the shape of the evidence as it currently stands, and it applies with varying strength to nearly every early civilization we have studied in detail. One possible explanation is that the developmental phases did exist, but took place in regions that are now inaccessible beneath modern cities, under meters of alluvial sediment or on coastal plains that were submerged when sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age. If the foundational experiments in architecture, agriculture, and social organisation occurred in lowland or coastal environments, between roughly 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, much of the physical evidence could have been destroyed by the same environmental changes that reshaped the world's coastlines. The civilizations we recognise as the earliest Sumer Egypt, the Indus Valley Corral, would then not be true beginnings but continuations inheriting knowledge from predecessors whose settlements now lie under water or silt. That is not a fringe hypothesis. It is a logical consequence of the fact that sea levels rose by more than 100 metres during the period in question, inundating millions of square kilometres of formerly habitable land. What was built on that land, by whom, and how much of it influenced what came after, are questions that the flooded shelves of the world's continents may one day help to answer. But for now, they remain largely beyond our reach, sealed beneath the same silent water that may also hold the answer to a different question. Not how these civilizations began, but how the one that may have preceded them came to its end. How a world disappears. In 1628 BCE, give or take a few years depending on which dating method you trust, the volcanic island of Thera in the Aegean Sea tore itself apart. The eruption was one of the largest in recorded human history, 4 to 5 times more powerful than Krakatoa, and it ejected somewhere between 40 and 60 cubic kilometres of rock and ash into the atmosphere. The Minoan settlement of Akrotiri on the island's southern coast was buried under metres of pumice so quickly that frescoes were preserved amid brushstroke, and pottery was found still sitting on shelves. The blast generated tsunamis that struck the northern coast of Crete, roughly 100 kilometres to the south, with enough force to damage port towns and disrupt the maritime trade networks that sustained the Minoan economy. Within a generation, the civilization that had dominated the Aegean for centuries, a civilization with running water, multi-story buildings, a written script, and a fleet that controlled trade across the eastern Mediterranean, had entered a decline from which it never recovered. The Minoans did not vanish overnight, but the eruption damaged them in ways that compounded over decades, weakening their infrastructure, disrupting their food supply, and leaving them vulnerable to the Mycenaean expansion that eventually absorbed what remained. A single geological event lasting perhaps a few days set in motion a collapse that erased one of the ancient world's most sophisticated cultures from active history. If not for the preserved ruins at Akrotiri and Knossos, we might know almost nothing about them at all. The Thera eruption is useful to consider not because it explains the disappearance of any particular unknown civilization, but because it demonstrates how quickly and completely a complex society can be undone by forces beyond its control, and how little evidence might survive if conditions were slightly less favourable for preservation. Akrotiri was buried in dry volcanic ash which sealed it almost perfectly, but if the same civilization had been situated on a low-lying coast struck by a tsunami rather than buried by pumice, the remains would not have been sealed, they would have been scattered ground down and pulled into the sea. Within a few centuries there might be nothing left to find. The difference between a civilization that is remembered and one that is forgotten can come down to something as arbitrary as the chemistry of the material that covered it. Ash preserves, water destroys, sand buries slowly and unevenly. Ice can hold things intact for millennia, but releases them in fragments when it melts. The medium of destruction determines the medium of memory, and for any culture that existed along coastlines that were swallowed by rising seas, at the end of the last ice age the medium was the worst possible one: saltwater tidal action, and the slow grinding of sediment across whatever was left behind. The post-glacial sea level rise was not a single dramatic flood, despite what some myths seem to suggest. It occurred in pulses over several thousand years, with periods of rapid increase called meltwater pulses, during which sea levels could rise by several meters within a few centuries. Meltwater pulse 1A, around 14,500 years ago, may have raised global sea levels by as much as 20 meters in less than 500 years. For any community living on a coastal plain, and coastal plains would have been among the most attractive places to settle, offering access to marine resources. Fertile soil and natural harbours that rate of change would have been noticeable within a single lifetime. Not a wall of water arriving in an afternoon, but a slow, relentless advance that swallowed a few more meters of shoreline each year, forcing communities to retreat inland, abandon infrastructure, and rebuild further from the water's edge. Over generations, the original settlements would disappear beneath the waves, and the memory of them would compress into the kind of story that could survive without writing a story about a time when the sea rose and swallowed the land, when cities were lost beneath the water, when everything changed and the survivors had to start again. It is worth pausing here to consider what those survivors would have carried with them. Not the physical structures, those would be gone. Not the written records, if there were any, those would likely have been lost with the buildings that housed them. What survivors carry is knowledge. How to grow certain crops, how to navigate by the stars, how to work stone or metal, how to organize a group of people for a large project. These skills are portable in a way that architecture is not, and they can persist for generations through oral transmission and practical demonstration, even after every physical artifact of their origin has been destroyed. A community displaced by rising seas might settle, inland merge with existing populations, and gradually lose its distinct identity, while its practical knowledge becomes part of the shared toolkit of the new combined group. The techniques would survive, the name of the people who brought them would not, and after enough generations the host culture would assume the knowledge had always been theirs, a local invention, a product of their own ingenuity, with no memory of the coastal strangers who had arrived centuries earlier with skills that seemed at the time remarkably advanced. This is not the only way a civilization can disappear, but it may be the most relevant one for the kind of unknown culture we have been considering. Disease warfare, internal collapse, and deliberate erasure by conquering successors have all ended civilizations throughout history, and any of them could account for the disappearance of a group that left the traces we have been examining. But environmental catastrophe, particularly the slow catastrophe of rising seas, has a unique quality. It does not just destroy the people, it destroys the place. A war leaves ruins, a plague leaves empty buildings, but a coastline that sinks beneath the ocean leaves nothing visible at all, only a flat expanse of water, where something used to be giving no indication to anyone sailing across it, thousands of years later, that they are passing over the remains of a world that once held as much meaning to its inhabitants as ours holds to us. The question of whether such a world existed cannot be answered by the absence of evidence alone. Absence is not proof of anything, it is simply silence, and silence can mean many things. But when that silence is combined with the kinds of traces we have followed through these chapters, the anomalous stonework, the maps that seem to predate their makers, the myths that echo across continents, the ghost, populations in our DNA, the seeds that crossed oceans before the ships, we know it begins to feel less like the silence of a place where nothing happened, and more like the silence of a place where something happened, and the record was erased by forces that do not discriminate between the ordinary and the extraordinary. What remains, if anything, may not be waiting in a dramatic ruin or a sunken city. It may be something far quieter, a fingerprint left not on stone or soil, but on the cultures, the habits and the unexamined assumptions of the civilizations that came after carrying forward an inheritance they never knew they received, the soft footprint. There is a word in the Tamil language Thodar that means something close to continuation, the act of carrying forward without interruption. It is used for rivers, for conversations, for traditions that persist so long that no one remembers when they began. It does not imply effort. It implies inevitability, the way a river does not decide to keep flowing, but simply does because the slope beneath it has not changed. If an unknown civilization once shaped parts of the world and was then forgotten, its most lasting legacy may not be anything we can dig up or decode. It may be something closer to Thodar, a continuation so deeply embedded in the way we live that it has become invisible not because it was hidden, but because it was never separate enough from everything else to be noticed as something distinct. We do not see it for the same reason we do not see the air. It is everywhere, and it has been here longer than our ability to name it. Consider how much of your daily life rests on foundations you have never examined. The proportions of the rooms you live in follow conventions that can be traced back through centuries of architectural tradition, each generation borrowing from the one before it, without asking where the original measurements came from. The crops you eat, wheat, rice, maize, potatoes, were domesticated so long ago that their wild ancestors are nearly unrecognizable, shaped by thousands of years of selection that began with someone somewhere choosing one seed over another for reasons we can only guess at. The calendar you follow divides time in ways that reflect astronomical observations made before any currently known civilization had a name. Even the roads you drive on in many parts of the world follow paths that were first walked by people whose identities have been absorbed into the accumulated anonymity of deep time. None of these things announce their origins. They simply function, and their functioning is so seamless that the question of where they came from rarely arises. But each one represents a decision made by someone, a choice about how to measure, how to build, how to grow, how to move through the world. And some of those decisions may be far older than the cultures we credit with making them. This is what a soft footprint looks like. It is not a monument. It is not an inscription. It is not a golden artifact gleaming under museum lights. It is the quiet persistence of a method, a proportion, a practice, a pattern, something so useful or so natural that it was adopted and readopted across centuries without anyone stopping to ask who first thought of it. A technique for joining timber that appears in boat-building traditions separated by oceans, a method of terracing hillsides for agriculture that shows up independently in the Andes in Southeast Asia and in parts of the Mediterranean, using principles so similar that the differences feel more like regional accents than separate inventions. A way of reading the night sky that surfaces in the navigation traditions of cultures that, according to our records, never exchanged a single word. Each of these could be the product of convergent thinking, human minds, solving human problems in human ways, arriving at the same answers because the questions were the same. That explanation is always available, and it is often correct. But it is also possible that some of these convergences are not convergences at all, that they are inheritances passed along so many times and through so many hands that the original source dissolved into the background of ordinary knowledge indistinguishable from something everyone simply knows. If that is true, and we are speaking in possibilities, not certainties, then the unknown civilization we have been tracing through these chapters did not fail to leave a mark. It left the largest mark imaginable. It left the way we live. Not the way any one culture lives, but the shared substrate beneath all of them. The common methods, the recurring proportions, the agricultural staples, the navigational instincts, the architectural principles that appear across civilizations, as if they were always there waiting to be discovered rather than invented. The absence of a name does not mean the absence of influence. It means only that the influence arrived without a label, and over time the label ceased to matter, because the thing itself had become indispensable. We do not ask who invented the idea of storing grain for winter, or who first realized that a circular base distributes weight more evenly than a square one, or who first noticed that certain stars return to the same position at the same time each year. These insights feel like they belong to everyone, and perhaps they do. But someone had them first, and in having them first they gave the rest of us a starting point we have never fully acknowledged. There is a particular kind of loss that comes with forgetting a source. It is not the sharp loss of destruction, a library burned, a city razed, a people scattered. It is the gradual loss of context, the slow fading of attribution, until the gift and the giver are no longer connected in anyone's memory. The knowledge survives, but the story of how it arrived does not. And without that story, we are left with a version of our own past that feels complete, but may not be a narrative in which every civilization begins from scratch. Every innovation is locally born, and the deep continuity that might connect distant cultures to a shared origin is invisible simply because we have not learned how to see it yet. That does not mean the connection is there. It means we do not yet have the tools or the evidence to confirm or deny it with certainty. And in the absence of certainty, the most honest position is the one that holds both possibilities open, that the patterns we have noticed might be coincidence, and that they might not. What we have followed through these chapters is not a conclusion. It is a trail, faint, intermittent, sometimes vanishing into strain, where no path is visible, sometimes reappearing in a place that makes you pause and look more carefully. The stones with their mismatched foundations, the maps with their impossible details, the myths that remember what writing forgot, the ghost populations encoded in our cells, the seeds that crossed water before the ships we know, the buildings that arrived already sophisticated, the tools whose methods we have lost, the astronomical alignments that point to knowledge older than the civilizations that built around them. None of these alone is enough to rewrite the story of human history, but together they occupy a space in our understanding that is not quite empty and not quite full, a space where something might have been, where the silence is not the silence of nothing, but the silence of something that has been quiet for a very long time. You do not need to decide tonight what that something was. The questions will still be here tomorrow and the night after that. And in whatever future moment you find yourself standing before a wall whose lower stones do not match the ones above, or reading a story whose practical details seem too precise for a myth, or learning that your own DNA carries the echo of a people no archaeologist has ever named. These questions do not demand urgency. They ask only for willingness, the willingness to sit with uncertainty, to hold a possibility without needing to resolve it, to let the unknown remain unknown without treating it as empty. Because the deepest footprints are not always the ones pressed hardest into the earth. Sometimes they are the ones pressed so softly that you can only see them when the light falls at a certain angle late in the day, when the shadows are long enough to reveal what the brightness had been hiding all along. The world is full of such shadows, and they have been waiting patiently for someone to notice them, not to explain them, not to argue about them, but simply to sit beside them for a while and wonder what they might once have been. If you were to stand again at Ollantaytambo late in the afternoon when the Andean light turns amber and the valley below goes quiet, those 6 andesite blocks would still be there, fitted edge to edge, unmoved by 5 centuries of earthquakes, saying nothing and needing to say nothing. The razor blade still would not fit between them. The upper wall would still look like a different conversation built on top of an older, steadier voice. and the mountain across the valley where the stone was quarried and carried from would still hold the scars of that work in its rock face, visible to anyone who thinks to look. The only thing that has changed between the beginning of this evening and now is the angle from which you see them. Not closer necessarily, but wider. The stones are no longer just stones in Peru. They are part of a longer sentence, one that stretches through mismatched foundations in Lebanon, through maps drawn from sources no one can trace, through flood myths told on every inhabited continent, through the DNA of people whose ancestors were never named in any record that survived. We have not answered the question we started with. That was never the intention. The question whether an unknown civilization once shaped parts of our world and was then forgotten is not the kind that closes neatly at the end of an evening. It is the kind that stays open the way a landscape stays open, after the last road ends and the trail becomes grass and then nothing. You can stand at that edge without needing to take another step. The not knowing is not a failure. It is the honest shape of where we are. History is not a completed building. It is a site still under excavation, and most of the site has not been touched yet. Whole layers lie beneath the ones we have reached, and beneath those perhaps there are others compressed by time, softened by water, stripped of their labels by the simple passage of more years than language can comfortably hold. What we have is fragments, a carved vessel, too precise for its supposed tools, a seed growing on the wrong side of an ocean, a story told in a language that borrowed a word from someone no one remembers. These fragments do not assemble into a portrait, they assemble into a question, and the question is not diminished by the absence of an answer. It is in some ways made more honest by it. Because the willingness to hold a question without forcing it shut is its own kind of knowledge, the kind that does not wear away with time, but deepens the way a riverbed deepens not by being struck but by being patient. If anything stays with you from tonight, it does not need to be a theory or a name or a date. It might simply be the feeling that the ground beneath familiar things is deeper than it looks. That the bread you eat and the stars you recognize and the shape of the path outside your door each carry within them the residue of decisions made so long ago that the decision makers have become part of the soil itself. That is not a mystery to be solved. It is a texture to be noticed once softly and then let go. The night outside your window wherever you are is the same night that has settled over every place we visited together. It rests over the Andes and the Aegean, over the plains of Turkey, where Göbekli Tepe sleeps under its backfill over the Pacific, where the sweet potato somehow crossed before the sails we know. The same dark holds all of it, the found and the unfound, the named and the nameless, the remembered and the quietly dissolved. You do not need to carry any of it further tonight. Let the weight of the question set itself down beside you, the way a stone sets itself into earth, not with force, but with the slow agreement of gravity and time. Your breath is already slowing. The distance between one thought and the next is growing wider, and that widening is good. It means the day is finally letting go of you. Let it. Let the fragments rest where they are. Let the stones keep their patience. Let the unnamed ones remain unnamed for now, not because they do not matter, but because some things are better held lightly, like a name you almost remember, just before sleep present, familiar, not quite formed, and entirely at peace with being so. Rest well, traveller. The questions will keep. They have been keeping for a very long time.